Vietnam, if you're not aware, is that little red country in Southeast Asia. What we want to know is why did US soldiers get sent halfway around the world for that little country? The main thing to keep in mind is that this was during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we hated communism. And as you could probably guess, Vietnam was communist. We're not going to cover the entire long history of Vietnam, but here's some facts you should know. The French took over this part of the world in 1887 and ruled it as a colony for over 50 years. During this time, a Vietnamese resistance movement formed to fight for independence from France. This group would eventually evolve into our enemy during the Vietnam War. During its rule, the French did add a lot of infrastructure to the major Vietnamese cities, which is why some of the cities in Vietnam look a lot like New Orleans. The French controlled Vietnam until they were defeated by the Axis powers in World War II. Unable to control even their own country, they gave up on trying to control Vietnam, which was quickly occupied by the Japanese. As a result, Japan wasn't just our enemy, it was the enemy of Vietnam as well, which made the US and Vietnam de facto allies throughout all of World War II. At the end of the war, when the Japanese were defeated, Vietnam declared independence, and their independence lasted just 20 days. At that point, the French decided they still wanted Vietnam, so they sent soldiers to occupy it once again. Technically, this was a dispute between two nations we were friends with, so both nations asked us for help. On the one hand, we were very much against one nation taking over another. After all, that's one of the causes of both world wars. So from that point of view, we should have condemned the French and taken Vietnam's side. However, this was the start of the Cold War, and the top priority of our foreign policy was enforcing the Truman Doctrine. So we picked France. At this time, the forces battling the French for control of Vietnam was a communist force led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Unfortunately, the French are only successful in two types of battles: when Napoleon is in charge, or when the US sends its whole army to fight alongside of him. From 1946 to 1954, neither of those conditions were true, and the French were defeated. As the French left Vietnam, it was split into two countries. North Vietnam was left to the communists, and South Vietnam was left for the capitalists. In a year, all of Vietnam would get to vote for one leader to reunite the country. It looked like Vietnam may be at peace for the first time that century. However, the US knew the communist North would not allow free and fair elections. We knew the North would suppress votes to ensure a communist would take over. Again, since the end of World War II, the US government had promised to stop the spread of communism. So the US President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, decided to send in a limited number of special forces troops called advisors to help the South Vietnamese fight the spread of communism. And that's why the first deaths on the Vietnam Memorial are from 1955. The picture on this slide is a visualization of what's called the Domino Theory. The theory goes that if one country falls to communism, it will inevitably spread to its neighboring country, and its neighbor, and so on, unless something manages to stop them from falling like dominoes. As you can see here, it was the US military that was supposed to help prop up countries in danger of communist takeover. So what do you think of this domino theory? Is there any evidence that it is correct? Let's look at the spread of communism. Here is 1920. Communism has just started. It's only in one country, the largest country in the world, our nemesis during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. Here we are 20 years later, after World War II. Eastern Europe has fallen to communism because the Soviet army conquered Eastern Europe in the second half of World War II and used their military to create communist countries by force. In Asia, you can also see that North Korea is already communist as well. Here's 10 years after that. All of China and Vietnam are communist. This is when President Eisenhower decided to send in the advisors to stop the spread in Vietnam. Finally, here's communism at its height. And yeah, a lot of the world did become communist, including our neighbor Cuba. So is the domino theory correct? To an extent, yeah. So, 1964. This is the other year I gave you for the start of the Vietnam War. At this point, special forces have been fighting in Vietnam for 9 years. On the right here is a patch from one of those groups. Special forces operations are usually secret. The American public does not know what they're doing. But we did know about the Navy. We also had two destroyers, pictured here, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, off the coast of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. In 1964, the Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. These boats were designed in the Soviet Union, by the way. And you can probably tell just by looking, but a Vietnamese torpedo boat versus a U.S. destroyer is a very unfair matchup. Maddox was hit by a single bullet and in return sank one of the attacking vessels and damaged the others. 2 days later, the Turner Joy reported that they were under attack, but they weren't. Someone in the ship had just misread the radar screen. Still, the U.S. president called this open aggression on the high seas and asked Congress to authorize him to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States to prevent further aggression. The Congress gave him the okay. However, this was not a declaration of war. It was a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. There are a few things to keep in mind about this resolution. When Johnson asked for it, he neglected to inform Congress that the Turner Joy had actually not been attacked. He knew by then. He also neglected to mention that American Special Forces were operating in North Vietnam at the time, and this was probably a counterattack, not an unprovoked surprise attack. The truth of this incident came out 6 years later, which led to a widening of the credibility gap. We'll come back to that idea again later. The results of the Gulf of Tonkin incident are clear. This resolution sent 2.7 million U.S. soldiers, more than 9% of that generation, into Vietnam between 1964 and 1975. And this is why the war is often dated from 1964. The last startling fact I'm going to leave you with is this. Before 1965, fewer than half of all Americans had heard of Vietnam. By 1969, more than half of all Americans knew someone who was wounded or killed in Vietnam.